am an American Negro, one of 20 million. I want to show you something of our life here.
In America is a complex and nuanced experience that has been shaped by centuries of systemic racism and discrimination. From the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow laws to ongoing issues such as police brutality and economic inequality, Black Americans continue to face a range of challenges in their daily lives. One of the most pressing issues facing Black Americans today is the ongoing problem of police brutality. Despite progress in recent years, Black people are still disproportionately targeted and killed by police. According to a 2017 study by the Washington Post, Black Americans were 2.5 times more likely to be shot and killed by police than white Americans. Another major issue facing Black Americans is economic inequality. Despite some progress in recent years, Black Americans continue to face significant disparities in areas such as income, wealth, and poverty. According to data from the U.S. Census Bureau, the median income for Black households is just over 60% of that for white households, and the poverty rate for Black Americans is almost 3 times higher than for white Americans. In addition to these more well-known issues, Black Americans also face a range of other challenges, including discrimination in housing and employment, limited access to quality education and health care, and barriers to political representation. Despite these challenges, Black Americans have a long history of resilience and resistance. From the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s to ongoing social justice movements like Black Lives Matter, Black Americans have fought and continue to fight for justice and equality. It's important to remember that Black Americans are not a monolithic group, and experiences can vary greatly depending on factors like class, gender, and geography. It's also important to remember that many of the problems that Black Americans face today are rooted in long-standing systemic issues and will require sustained effort and commitment to address.
Everyone knows about the Negro musician or singer, but here is an example of something that perhaps you haven't seen. Here, in an operating room in one of New York's hospitals, a man's life is at stake. The surgeons are all Negroes. For many years now, Negro physicians and surgeons have practiced their professions in hospitals throughout our country. There is great variety in Negro life. We do all kinds of work. We certainly aren't all surgeons. In fact, many of us still do lowly jobs. Let's go out to the part of the country where I come from, the Midwest. Here, many Negroes own their own farms. This farm has been in the family for 3 generations.
Black Americans also face unique challenges in the criminal justice system. Black Americans are disproportionately represented in the prison population and are more likely to be sentenced to longer prison terms than white Americans for the same crimes. This is due in part to the war on drugs, WARN, which has disproportionately affected Black communities and has led to a significant increase in the number of Black Americans in prison. Another issue that disproportionately affects Black Americans is voter suppression. Despite the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which was designed to protect the voting rights of minorities, Black Americans still face a range of barriers to voting, including restrictive voter ID laws, purging of voter rolls, and gerrymandering. These practices have the effect of limiting the political power of Black Americans and making it more difficult for them to have their voices heard in the political process. Black Americans also face discrimination in the workplace, which can limit their access to job opportunities and make it more difficult for them to climb the economic ladder. Studies have shown that Black Americans are less likely to be hired for jobs and are more likely to be passed over for promotions than their white counterparts. They also face discrimination in the housing market, which can limit their access to safe and affordable housing. Despite these challenges, Black Americans have made significant strides in recent years. The election of President Barack Obama in 2008 was a historic moment that demonstrated the progress that had been made in the country toward racial equality. Black Americans have also made significant contributions to American culture, from music and literature to business and politics. It is important to remember that the experiences of Black Americans are not static, and progress is being made in some areas while setbacks occur in others. It is also important to acknowledge that these issues are not unique to Black Americans, but are part of the broader struggle for social justice and equality for all marginalized communities. In conclusion, the documentary will highlight the challenges faced by Black Americans today, from police brutality and economic inequality to discrimination in the criminal justice system and the workplace. It will also examine the historical and systemic factors that have contributed to these issues and showcase the resilience and resistance of the Black community in the face of these challenges. It will also highlight the progress that has been made and the ongoing efforts to create a more just and equitable society for all. Before the transatlantic slave trade, Africa was a continent of diverse cultures and societies. Black people in Africa had a rich history and heritage, with complex systems of governance, economic systems, and social structures. One of the most advanced societies in Africa at the time was the Kingdom of Ghana, which existed from the 6th to the 13th century. The kingdom was located in what is now southeastern Mauritania and western Mali, and it controlled the trans-Saharan trade routes, making it one of the wealthiest and most powerful empires in West Africa. Another notable civilization was the Kingdom of Mali, which existed from the 13th to the 16th century. The kingdom, located in what is now Mali, was known for its impressive architecture, including the Great Mosque of Djenné, which is still standing today and is considered one of the most famous examples of Sudano-Sahelian architecture. The Kingdom of Songhai, located in what is now Niger and Mali, was another important civilization. It was the largest empire in West Africa and existed from the 14th to the 16th century. It was known for its advanced agricultural techniques, as well as its flourishing trade and cultural exchange with other parts of Africa and the Islamic world. The Kingdom of Congo, located in what is now Angola, Congo, and Gabon, was another significant state in pre-colonial Africa. The Kingdom of Congo was known for its complex political and social structure, as well as its artistic achievements, including the production of textiles, ceramics, and metalwork. These are just a few examples of the many advanced societies that existed in Africa before the transatlantic slave trade. However, it's important to note that the continent of Africa was not a monolithic entity, with different ethnic groups, cultures, and societies that had their customs and traditions. The transatlantic slave trade, which began in the 15th century and lasted for more than 4 centuries, had a devastating impact on Africa and its people. Millions of Black Africans were forcibly taken from their homes and transported to the Americas to work as slaves on plantations. This forced migration and the loss of so many people had a devastating impact on African societies, economies, and cultures, which is still felt today. The transatlantic slave trade was one of the most brutal and inhumane practices in human history. Millions of Black Africans were forcibly taken from their homes and families and transported across the Atlantic to work as slaves on plantations in the Americas. The journey, known as the Middle Passage, was a brutal and deadly one, with many slaves dying from disease, starvation, and abuse. The slave trade was fueled by the increasing demand for labor in the Americas, particularly in the colonies of the British, Spanish, and Portuguese empires. The slaves were taken from a wide range of African societies, but the majority were from West and Central Africa, where they were captured by European traders or by other African groups who sold them to the Europeans. Once they arrived in the Americas, slaves were often treated as nothing more than property and subjected to brutal conditions and abuse. They were forced to work long hours in fields, mines, and factories, and were often subjected to beatings and other forms of physical punishment. Slaves were also often separated from their families and communities and had no legal rights or protections. The slave trade also had a devastating impact on Africa, as it resulted in the forced migration of millions of people and the loss of human lives and resources. It also disrupted the economies and societies of African societies and caused a significant decline in the population of certain regions, which has had long-term effects on the continent. Despite the horrors of the transatlantic slave trade, it persisted for centuries, and it wasn't until the late 18th and early 19th centuries that the movement to abolish slavery began to gain momentum. This movement was led by a diverse group of people, including abolitionists, politicians, and former slaves themselves. It ultimately resulted in the abolition of slavery in the British Empire in 1833 and the United States in 1865, with the 13th Amendment of the Constitution. The legacy of the transatlantic slave trade continues to be felt today, as the descendants of enslaved Africans continue to face the effects of systemic racism and discrimination. It is an important and painful chapter in human history, and one that should not be forgotten, as it serves as a reminder of the atrocities that humans are capable of and the ongoing struggle for justice and equality for all. Slavery was one of the most brutal and inhumane practices in human history, and the enslaved black people were subject to unimaginable horrors and abuse. The physical conditions of slavery were often brutal, with slaves being forced to work long hours in fields, mines, and factories under harsh conditions. They were often subjected to beatings and other forms of physical punishment, and were denied necessities such as food, water, and medical care. One of the most brutal aspects of slavery was the separation of families. Slaves were often separated from their spouses, children, and parents, and were not allowed to form or maintain any kind of family bond. This was done to control and break the spirit of the enslaved people, and it had a devastating impact on the mental and emotional well-being of the enslaved. Slaves were also often subject to sexual abuse by their owners and overseers, who saw them as nothing more than property. This included rape, forced breeding, and sexual exploitation. Women were particularly vulnerable to sexual violence, and it was not uncommon for slave women to be forced to bear children for their masters. Slaves were also denied basic rights and freedoms, and were treated as property rather than human beings. They had no legal rights or protections, and were not allowed to vote, own property, or even testify in court. They were also denied education and were not allowed to learn to read or write. Despite the horrors of slavery, many enslaved people managed to resist, either through individual acts of rebellion or through organized resistance. However, these acts of resistance were often met with severe punishment, and many enslaved people were killed or brutally punished for their actions. Even those who did not actively resist slavery still faced the threat of violence at the hands of their masters and overseers. The legacy of slavery continues to be felt today, as the descendants of enslaved Africans continue to face the effects of systemic racism and discrimination. It is important to remember the atrocities of slavery and the ongoing struggle for justice and equality for all, and to work towards eradicating all forms of racism and discrimination in our society. After slavery was officially abolished in the United States, many Southern states passed laws known as Jim Crow laws, which institutionalized racial segregation and discrimination against Black Americans. These laws, which were in effect from the late 19th century to the mid-1960s, were designed to maintain white supremacy and to keep Black Americans in a subordinate position. One of the most infamous aspects of Jim Crow laws was the segregation of public spaces, such as schools, transportation, and restaurants. Black Americans were often forced to use separate and inferior facilities, such as separate drinking fountains, restrooms, and entrances. This segregation was often enforced by violence, and those who dared to challenge it could be subject to beatings, lynchings, and other forms of violence. Jim Crow, Laws also restricted Black Americans' right to vote through various discriminatory practices such as literacy tests and other voting restrictions. This made it difficult for Black Americans to participate in the political process, and it effectively denied them a voice in government. These laws also had a significant impact on the economic opportunities available to Black Americans. They were often denied jobs, loans, and other economic opportunities, and were forced to work in low-paying and dangerous jobs. They were also often denied access to quality education and health care, which further hindered their ability to succeed. The Jim Crow laws were not only limited to the South and affected the whole nation. It was not rare for Black Americans who lived in northern states to experience discrimination and racism. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, led by figures such as Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and Rosa Parks, challenged the system of Jim Crow laws and worked to end racial segregation and discrimination. Through protests, boycotts, and acts of civil disobedience, the civil rights movement ultimately led to the end of Jim Crow laws and the passage of important legislation, such as the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. However, it's important to note that the end of Jim Crow laws did not mean an end to racism and discrimination for Black Americans. Many of the issues that were created by the laws and practices of Jim Crow still exist today in various forms, and it requires continued efforts to address and eliminate the systemic racism that still exists in society. One of how racism and discrimination have been institutionalized in the United States is through the practice of redlining. This refers to the discriminatory practices used by banks and other lending institutions to deny loans and other financial services to people in certain neighborhoods based on their race. Historically, redlining was used to deny loans to Black Americans and other people of color, and it had a significant impact on the ability of these communities to access credit and build wealth. As a result, many Black Americans were forced to live in overcrowded, segregated, and poorly maintained neighborhoods, with limited access to quality housing, education, and health care. These conditions were further exacerbated by policies of the Reagan administration in the 1980s, which led to the mass incarceration of Black Americans. The war on drugs, in particular, had a disproportionate impact on Black communities, as they were disproportionately targeted and arrested for drug offenses. This led to a significant increase in the number of Black Americans in prison, and it had a devastating impact on Black families and communities. The high incarceration rates, combined with the lack of economic opportunities and limited access to quality education and health care, have had a significant impact on the economic, social, and political advancement of Black Americans. Many Black Americans have been trapped in a cycle of poverty, unemployment, and discrimination, which has been a barrier to their ability to succeed and thrive in the United States. While some progress has been made in recent years to address these issues, the challenges faced by Black Americans continue to be significant. It is important to acknowledge the systemic nature of these issues and to continue working towards solutions that address the root causes of racism and discrimination. This includes policies aimed at increasing economic opportunity, improving access to education and healthcare, and addressing the issue of mass incarceration. United States policies have had a long-standing impact on breaking up Black family households and disrupting the social fabric of Black communities. One of the most significant examples of this is the practice of redlining, which I previously mentioned, where banks and other lending institutions denied loans and other financial services to people in certain neighborhoods based on their race. This practice has been a significant barrier to Black Americans' ability to build wealth, own property, and establish stable communities, and as a result, many Black Americans have been forced to live in overcrowded, segregated, and poorly maintained neighborhoods. Another example is the practice of urban renewal, which began in the mid-20th century and involved the displacement of thousands of Black families from their homes and neighborhoods. This was done in the name of slum clearance and urban renewal, but it often resulted in the destruction of vibrant and stable Black communities and the displacement of Black families to more isolated and impoverished neighborhoods. The war on drugs of the 1980s and 1990s also had a significant impact on black family households. The policies of the Reagan administration led to the mass incarceration of black Americans, and it had a devastating impact on black families and communities. The high incarceration rates resulted in many black children growing up in single-parent households or in households where one or both parents were absent due to incarceration. Additionally, the legacy of slavery and the system of sharecropping, which replaced slavery in some parts of the South, has also had a lasting impact on black family households. Sharecropping, which was a system of farming where landowners would provide land, tools, and seeds to the sharecropper in exchange for a portion of the crop, kept many black people in a state of economic dependency and poverty. This often resulted in families being separated and children being taken away from their parent. These policies and practices have had a lasting impact on black family households and communities, and they continue to be felt today. It is important to acknowledge the systemic nature of these issues and to continue working towards solutions that address the root causes of racism and discrimination, and that help to rebuild and support black families and communities. White mobs have destroyed many black towns throughout the history of the United States, and this has had a devastating impact on black communities and their ability to build wealth and establish stable communities. One of the most infamous examples of this is the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre, where a white mob attacked the prosperous Greenwood district of Tulsa, Oklahoma, also known as Black Wall Street. The mob burned down homes, businesses, and churches, and killed an estimated 300 black residents. The destruction of the Greenwood district resulted in the loss of lives and the displacement of thousands of black residents, and it also resulted in the theft of millions of dollars of wealth from the black community. Another example is the destruction of Rosewood, Florida, in 1923, where a white mob burned down the entire town and killed many of the black residents. This was done in response to a false accusation that a white woman had been attacked by a black man. The destruction of the town resulted in the displacement of the entire black population, and many of the residents never returned. There are many other examples of white mobs destroying black towns throughout history, including the destruction of the black community of Wilmington, North Carolina, in 1898, and the destruction of the black community of Ocoee, Florida, in 1920. These acts of violence were often motivated by racism and a desire to steal land and wealth from black communities. These acts of violence, known as race massacres, were not only directed at black towns, but also at black communities in urban areas. These massacres were often carried out by white mobs with the support or the complacency of law enforcement and political authorities, and left many black people dead and many more injured, displaced, and homeless. These events were often orchestrated as a way to drive black people out of their homes, businesses, and communities, and were used as a tool to maintain white supremacy and control over resources, land, and political power. These race massacres were not only devastating in terms of loss of lives, properties, and communities, but also in terms of the long-term impact on the survivors and the descendants of the survivors. The trauma and the loss of wealth, homes, and communities affected the ability of the affected families to build a better future for themselves and contributed to the perpetuation of poverty, discrimination, and marginalization of black communities. It is important to acknowledge and remember these events and the role that white mobs and state-sanctioned violence played in destroying black communities and stealing their wealth, as it serves as a reminder of the atrocities that humans are capable of and the ongoing struggle for justice and reparations for the descendants of the survivors and the affected communities. Police brutality continues to be a significant issue in the United States, and it disproportionately affects black Americans. In recent years, there have been numerous high-profile cases of police officers using excessive force against black Americans, often resulting in death. These incidents have sparked widespread protests and calls for reform, but progress towards addressing the issue has been slow. One of the reasons for this lack of progress is the lack of accountability for police officers who use excessive force. The legal system and the police culture often protect officers from being held accountable for their actions. Police officers are often protected by qualified immunity, which makes it difficult to sue officers for misconduct, and police unions often support officers who are accused of misconduct. Additionally, there is a lack of transparency and oversight in the police department, which makes it difficult to know the extent of the problem and to hold officers accountable. Police departments often resist releasing information about misconduct, and many states have laws that make it difficult to obtain information about police officers. Furthermore, the United States government has failed to pass meaningful legislation to address the issue of police brutality. The previous administration had a lack of focus on this issue, and it was not a priority in the legislative agenda. While there have been some efforts to reform police departments, such as the establishment of community policing programs, many of these efforts have been insufficient to address the underlying issues of racial bias and lack of accountability. It is important to remember that police brutality is not just an issue affecting a few bad officers, but it is a systemic problem that reflects the broader issues of racism and discrimination in the United States. It requires a comprehensive approach, including changes in the legal system, police culture, and government policies, to address the issue and ensure justice and accountability for victims and their families. Another issue that continues to contribute to the problem of police brutality is the lack of diversity and representation within police departments. In many cities, the racial makeup of police departments does not reflect the racial makeup of the community they serve. This lack of diversity can lead to a lack of understanding and cultural competency among officers, which can contribute to incidents of police brutality. Furthermore, studies have shown that having a more diverse police force can lead to better relations between the police and the community and can reduce the use of excessive force. This suggests that increasing the representation of Black officers within police departments can be an effective way of reducing police brutality. Additionally, there is a need for more comprehensive police training that includes courses in de-escalation techniques, cultural competency, and implicit bias. This training should be mandatory and ongoing and also cover topics on how to handle situations involving people with mental health issues to prevent unnecessary escalation and use of force. In conclusion, the problem of police brutality in the United States is a complex and systemic issue that requires a comprehensive approach. It requires changes in the legal system, police culture, government policies, and an increase in representation and diversity within police departments, as well as improved training for police officers. It also requires a more significant effort to address the underlying issues of racism and discrimination in society. It is important to continue to raise awareness and demand accountability and change to ensure justice and safety for Black Americans and all marginalized communities. Black Americans have been historically excluded from many opportunities to build wealth and protect their communities due to systemic racism and discrimination. However, there are steps that Black Americans can take to build wealth and protect their communities. Despite these barriers, one important step is to focus on education and career development, as a strong education and a good job can provide a stable income and a path to building wealth. This includes investing in higher education, such as college or vocational training, and seeking out opportunities for professional development and career advancement. Another important step is to focus on building financial literacy and knowledge, as this can help Black Americans make better financial decisions and manage their money effectively. This includes learning about different types of investment options, such as stocks, bonds, and real estate, and developing a budget and saving plan. Additionally, supporting Black-owned businesses and investing in Black-owned property and businesses can be an effective way to build wealth and protect Black communities. Black-owned businesses can provide jobs, goods, and services to the community, and investing in Black-owned property can help to stabilize neighborhoods and increase property values. Black Americans can also work to address the issues of police brutality and systemic racism by participating in grassroots movements and civic engagement. This could include joining or supporting organizations that advocate for police reform and participating in local and national elections to support candidates who prioritize issues affecting Black communities. It's also important to remember that building wealth and protecting communities is not only an individual responsibility but a collective one as well. It requires the collaboration and support of the wider community and the government to address the systemic issues that have hindered the ability of Black Americans to build wealth and protect their communities. In summary, building wealth and protecting communities for Black Americans requires a combination of individual and collective efforts. It requires a focus on education and career development, financial literacy and knowledge, supporting Black-owned businesses, and participating in civic engagement and grassroots movements. It also requires addressing the systemic issues that have hindered the ability of Black Americans to build wealth and protect their communities, such as discrimination and racism, through advocacy and policy change. It's important to remember that building wealth and protecting communities is a continuous process and requires the participation and support of all members of the Black community and society as a whole. This includes creating more opportunities for Black Americans to access education, housing, and employment, to build wealth, and working towards eradicating systemic racism and discrimination. In conclusion, the documentary has highlighted the various ways in which Black Americans have been historically and systematically oppressed and discriminated against in the United States. From the horrors of slavery to the brutalities of Jim Crow laws, to the ongoing issues of police brutality and systemic racism, Black Americans have had to overcome numerous barriers to build wealth and protect their communities. It is important to remember and acknowledge the atrocities of the past, and to understand that the legacy of slavery and discrimination continues to affect Black Americans today. It is also important to recognize the resilience and resistance of Black Americans throughout history, who have fought for justice and equality despite the immense challenges they have faced. However, it's also important to note that there is still work to be done to address the ongoing issues and to ensure that Black Americans have equal opportunities to build wealth, have access to education, housing, and employment, and protect their communities. This requires the participation and support of all members of society to address systemic racism and discrimination, and to create more opportunities for Black Americans to succeed and thrive. The documentary serves as a reminder of the ongoing struggle for justice and equality for Black Americans, and the importance of continuing to work towards eradicating racism and discrimination in all forms so that all people can live in a just and equal society.